A billionaire's wife was dying from a boil on her face. 15 world-class surgeons had exhausted every protocol for 6 days. Nothing worked. The swelling had grown so massive it threatened her airway, and time was running out. Then, a 54-year-old janitor holding a mop knocked on the door and said, "I know how to draw it out." She had no medical degree, no license, just hands that had ground herbs in a Louisiana village most New Yorkers couldn't find on a map. Invisible for 19 years, Ruth had mopped these floors in silence. But her grandmother had taught her secrets that Columbia Medical School never learned. Techniques passed down through 4 generations that could draw an infection without cutting. Marcus Carter nearly had security remove her. His wife was hours from a surgery that could disfigure her permanently. Or worse. "Get out of this room. This is a private facility." But Elaine Carter looked into Ruth's eyes and saw something the expensive specialists didn't have. Peace. "Let her try," Elaine whispered through swollen lips. Ruth had one chance. If she failed, she'd lose everything. Her job, maybe her freedom, her dignity. If she succeeded, she'd prove that the woman everyone ignored knew more than the experts everyone trusted. She placed her calloused, chemical-worn hands on that billionaire wife's fevered face. And what happened in the next 2 hours would either make her a hero or destroy her completely. The infection was spreading. The surgical team was scrubbing in. And Ruth started doing something none of them had ever seen before. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about where healing actually comes from. 6 hours earlier, Ruth was just the custodian, invisible, ignored, holding a mop instead of hope. But she was listening. And what she heard through that sweet door made her spirit groan. She'd been listening for days now, not because she was nosy, but because something in her bones told her to pay attention. She'd heard the doctors cycling through their procedures, heard the increasingly desperate consultations, heard Elaine's cries turning from sharp to hollow, from angry to resigned. And Ruth knew, with the certainty that came from watching her grandmother heal 12 infections just like this one before Ruth was 16 years old, exactly what needed to happen. The boil was enraged, inflamed beyond what force could fix, stuck in a state where cutting would only spread the poison, but that Ruth's grandmother could have soothed in 3 days with nothing but crushed roots, prayer, and patience, passed down through 4 generations of healers who learned from necessity, not textbooks. Ruth looked at the door, then at her reflection in the polished marble floor, then at the security camera blinking red in the corner. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong. She'd lose her job, definitely. Probably face charges for practicing medicine without a license. Might even be banned from every hospital in the city. Then she thought about what would happen if she was right and did nothing. A woman would die, maybe unnecessarily, and Ruth would carry that weight for however many years God gave her left. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, thick with Louisiana soil and Sunday morning conviction. "When you know how to help, baby girl, staying quiet is the same as watching someone drown." Ruth set down her mop, smoothed her worn scrubs, and knocked on the sweet door. What would you risk to save one life when the world says you're nobody qualified to try? If this story matters to you, subscribe now so you don't miss out on our daily uploads, and let us know where you're watching from. Ruth had learned to be invisible long before she ever stepped foot in Manhattan Memorial. It was a survival skill she developed as a child in rural Louisiana, in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, where being poor meant learning to take up as little space as possible, where you learned that powerful people didn't like being reminded that you existed, that you needed things, that you knew things they didn't. She'd come to New York 19 years ago with nothing but $340 in a coffee tin and the phone number of a cousin who'd promised her work. That cousin had moved 3 weeks before Ruth arrived. No forwarding address, and Ruth had spent her first 2 weeks in America sleeping on a church pew and eating day-old bagels from a sympathetic bakery owner who never asked questions. The job at Manhattan Memorial had been a miracle, or at least that's what the employment agency said. Night shift custodian, minimum wage, no benefits. But it was real work with a real paycheck, and after 8 months, they'd helped her get her papers in order. Ruth had been grateful. So grateful that she never complained about the floor she scrubbed, the blood she mopped up, the way doctors stepped around her like she was furniture. But Ruth carried something those doctors didn't have. She carried the knowledge of 4 generations of Louisiana healers, women who'd brought people back from the edge with nothing but faith, herbs, and the absolute refusal to let someone die when there was something they could do about it. Her grandmother, Ruth Holloway Sr., had been the town's only healer for 35 years. She'd treated over 400 people, lost only 5, and those losses had marked her soul until the day she passed. And now, standing outside that private suite with her mop bucket beside her, young Ruth felt her grandmother's hands on her shoulders, felt that ancestral knowing rising up through her bones, felt the weight of 4 generations of women who'd said yes when it was dangerous, who'd stepped forward when it was foolish, who'd trusted God more than they feared man. She knocked again, louder this time. The door opened a crack. A nurse's face appeared, young, tired, irritated. "What?" Ruth's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to speak to the family about Mrs. Carter." The nurse's eyes flicked down to Ruth's uniform, to the mop bucket, to the name tag that said housekeeping in block letters. "This is a private suite. You need to leave." The door started to close. Ruth's hand shot out, not aggressive, just firm, and held it open. "Please, I can help her." For a moment, the nurse just stared. Then she turned back into the room, and Ruth heard her say something to someone inside. Male voices rose in response, angry, dismissive. But Ruth didn't move. Most miracles don't enter through the front door. They come through the back, through the servant's entrance, through the people nobody's watching. Ruth had been invisible for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. 19 years of mopping floors in this hospital. 19 years of stepping aside when doctors rushed past. 19 years of hearing her own footsteps echo in empty hallways at 3 a.m. while the city slept and the sick suffered, and she cleaned up what was left behind. She'd learned the rhythm of invisibility early. When you're poor, when you're black, when you're a woman with no letters after your name and an accent that marks you as other, you learn to move through the world like water. No resistance, no confrontation. You learn to say yes, ma'am, and no, sir, and whatever you need. And you learn to swallow your thoughts like bitter medicine, because speaking up costs more than staying quiet. But Ruth had never let invisibility steal her dignity. She showed up on time. She did her work well. She smiled at patients even when they looked through her. She prayed over the rooms she cleaned, quietly, under her breath, asking God to heal the people who'd laid in those beds, to comfort the families who'd wept in those chairs, to guide the doctors who'd stood in those doorways, trying to decide who lived and who didn't. And she listened. God, did she listen? That's how she'd heard about Elaine Carter. The whispers in the hallways, the consultations that grew more desperate, the way the surgical team talked in hushed, frustrated tones about the case that wouldn't resolve, the infection that wouldn't respond, the woman whose face was swelling so badly they were running out of time. Ruth had heard it all, and she'd recognized it immediately. The memory came back sharp and clear, like it always did. Louisiana, summer, 1993. Ruth was 14 years old, standing in her grandmother's kitchen, watching her grind dried plantain leaves with a mortar and pestle. The smell was bitter and green, like crushed medicine and earth. Her grandmother, Ruth Holloway Sr., though everyone called her Mama Ruth, worked with her hands, slow and deliberate, grinding the leaves into a fine powder. You watching, baby? Yes, ma'am. This here's for drawing. When the body's got poison it can't let go of, you got to coax it out gentle, not force, not cut. Coax. 14-year-old Ruth leaned closer. How you know it'll work? Mama Ruth smiled, her face creased with years of sun and faith and knowing. Because God don't make nothing without the cure already planted somewhere. We just got to be humble enough to find it. That summer, Ruth watched her grandmother heal a man named Thomas Lee, who'd come to their porch with an infection on his neck that looked like death itself. 3 days of poultices, 3 days of prayer, 3 days of Mama Ruth's hands working with a confidence that came from something deeper than training. The infection drained. The fever broke. Thomas Lee lived another 20 years, and Ruth learned something the hospitals would never teach her. God doesn't always teach in classrooms. Sometimes he teaches in kitchens. Sometimes he teaches through the hands of women the world. Calls unqualified. Standing outside Elaine Carter's door now, Ruth felt that same knowing rising up. She'd seen this before. The swelling. The way the doctors kept trying to force a solution when the body needed gentleness. The way modern medicine kept cutting and drugging when what was needed was patience and faith, and the kind of healing that didn't come with a bill. But fear came too. What if she was wrong? What if she stepped into that room and embarrassed herself? What if they called security? What if they arrested her for practicing medicine without a license? She could lose everything. Her job, her apartment, her standing in the small community of church mothers who respected her, who called her Sister Ruth and asked her to pray over their grandchildren. She could lose her freedom. But then another thought, quieter and more insistent. What if you're right and you say nothing? That was the thought that broke her. Because Ruth had carried regret before. She'd stayed silent before when she knew she shouldn't have. She'd watched people suffer when she had knowledge that could help, and she'd swallowed her words because the world had taught her that her voice didn't matter. And every time, it had cost her something deeper than a job. It had cost her peace. Mama Ruth's voice came back to her, strong as a hymn. Baby girl, when you got the answer and you stay quiet, you're just as guilty as the sickness itself. Ruth closed her eyes. She prayed. Not a long prayer, not a formal one, just the kind of prayer that comes from the gut when you're terrified and surrendered at the same time. Lord, if this is you, make a way. If it's not, close the door. But don't let me stand here and do nothing when you've given me something to give. She opened her eyes. The door swung open wider. Marcus Carter stood there, tall, expensive suit wrinkled, eyes red from sleepless nights. Behind him, Ruth could see the doctors, the machines, the white walls, and in the bed, barely visible through the crowd, Elaine Carter's swollen face. Marcus looked at Ruth like she was an interruption he didn't have time for. You need to leave. Now. Ruth met his eyes. Sir, I know what's wrong with your wife, and I know how to help her. Marcus's jaw tightened. You're a janitor. Yes, sir, I am. Then you need to leave before I have you removed. Ruth didn't move. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She could feel 19 years of invisibility pressing down on her. She could feel 4 generations of women standing behind her, whispering, "Go on, baby, say it." So she did. I've seen this infection before. Back home. My grandmother healed 12 people with this exact condition. I know you don't have reason to trust me, but your wife is running out of time. And I'm asking you, begging you, to let me try. Silence filled the hallway. Marcus stared at her. The doctors behind him shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered something about calling security. And then, from the bed, a voice, weak, desperate, barely audible. Let her try. Elaine. Everyone turned. She was looking at Ruth through the narrow space between the doctors, her eyes swollen but fierce, her voice cracked but certain. Marcus, let her try. Marcus turned back to Ruth, his face a war between desperation and disbelief. My wife is delirious. She doesn't know what she's saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Elaine's voice was stronger now, fueled by something beyond pain. She pushed herself up slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at her swollen face. Marcus, they've been trying for 6 days. 6 days, and I'm getting worse. What do we have to lose? One of the surgeons, Dr. Brennan, his name tag read Chief of Surgery, stepped forward, his face tight with professional authority. Mr. Carter, I cannot in good conscience allow an untrained, unlicensed individual to touch your wife. The liability alone... I'll sign whatever you need, Elaine interrupted. Any waiver, any release. I don't care. Mrs. Carter, you're not thinking clearly. The infection has likely caused... I'm thinking clearly enough to know that 15 of you haven't fixed this. So yes, I want to try something different. This is where pride gets loud. Dr. Brennan's face flushed. Behind him, the other doctors shifted. Some uncomfortable, some indignant, all of them caught between their expertise and their failure. This is reckless, another doctor said. We have protocols, standards of care. Your standards haven't worked, Elaine said quietly. The room went silent. Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her, and Ruth saw something break in his face. The billionaire who'd built empires, who'd solved impossible problems with money and influence and sheer force of will, was watching the only thing that mattered slip through his fingers. And he was helpless. Elaine, he said softly, his voice cracking, what if she makes it worse? Ruth spoke then, her voice calm but firm. Sir, I won't make it worse. I promise you that. What I'm going to do is gentle. No cutting, no force. Just a drawing poultice to help her body release what it's holding on to. A drawing poultice? Dr. Brennan's tone dripped with skepticism. This isn't the 19th century. This is a life-threatening infection that requires... It requires what works, Marcus said suddenly. His voice had changed. Quieter, resigned, maybe even hopeful. He looked at Ruth. If my wife wants to try this, then we try this. Mr. Carter, I have to advise you in the strongest possible terms. Noted, Marcus said, cutting him off. He turned to Ruth. What do you need? Ruth's hands were shaking as she listed what she needed, not because she doubted what to do, but because the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her like gravity. Plantain, leaves, raw honey, activated charcoal, bentonite clay, apple cider vinegar, and I need access to a mortar and pestle, or something I can use to grind herbs. A young nurse, the same one who'd opened the door, spoke up. The hospital cafeteria might have some of that, and there's a pharmacy 2 blocks away. Marcus pulled out his phone. I'll have everything here in 20 minutes. Make it 10, Elaine whispered. While they waited, the room divided itself. On one side, the doctors, arms crossed, silent, watching Ruth like she was a grenade with the pin pulled. Their entire careers built on protocols, on evidence-based medicine, on peer-reviewed studies and clinical trials. And now, they were being asked to step aside for a janitor with folk remedies. On the other side, desperation. Marcus pacing, Elaine lying still, her breathing shallow, her face a landscape of pain, and Ruth standing near the window, praying under her breath, Lord, you got me here. Don't leave me now. Let my hands remember. Let her body receive. Let this work not for my glory, but for yours. Dr. Brennan approached her. You understand that if this goes wrong, you will be held legally responsible? Ruth met his eyes. Yes, sir. You could go to jail. Yes, sir. Then why are you doing this? Ruth paused. Then she said something that made even the skeptical doctors go quiet. Because my grandmother taught me that when God gives you knowledge, staying silent is the same as being complicit in suffering. And I'd rather risk my freedom than live with the knowledge that I could have helped and didn't. Dr. Brennan stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned away. 15 minutes later, everything Ruth needed sat on a sterile tray beside Elaine's bed. Ruth washed her hands 3 times. Not because protocol demanded it, but because this was sacred. This was the moment where generations of knowledge, passed down through kitchen tables and porch steps and whispered prayers, would either prove itself or fail publicly. She ground the plantain leaves first, adding charcoal and clay, mixing them with honey and vinegar until the paste formed, dark, thick, alive with purpose. The doctors watched, silent now, some curious despite themselves. Ruth approached the bed. Mrs. Carter, this is going to feel cool at first. Then it might tingle. That's normal. That's the drawing starting. But if at any point it burns or hurts in a bad way, you tell me immediately. Understand? Elaine nodded. Ruth dipped her fingers into the paste. And then she prayed, out loud this time, because this moment required witnesses. Lord, we ask for your healing hand. We ask that you guide what we're about to do. We ask that this woman's body remembers how to release what's poisoning it. We ask for mercy. We ask for grace. We ask that you be glorified in this room. Amen. Amen, Elaine whispered. Even Marcus, standing behind her, murmured it. Amen. Ruth placed her hand on Elaine's face, gentle, reverent, like she was touching something holy, because she was. This is the moment where belief becomes action. She began to apply the poultice, spreading it carefully over the swollen, angry boil. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the way Mama Ruth had taught her. Not rushed, not forceful, just present. Elaine inhaled sharply. Ruth paused. You okay? Yes, Elaine breathed. It's warm, but not bad. Keep going. So Ruth did. She covered the entire area, then placed a clean cloth over it, securing it gently. When she finished, she stepped back. Now we wait. How long? Marcus asked. Could be an hour. Could be 6. The body works on its own time, not ours. Dr. Brennan checked his watch, his expression unreadable. We'll monitor vitals. If anything deteriorates... It won't, Ruth said quietly. You can't know that. Ruth looked at him, and for the first time since entering the room, she smiled. Not smug, not defensive, just certain. You're right, sir. I can't know it the way you know things, but I believe it the way my grandmother believed things, and her belief healed more people than I can count. Dr. Brennan said nothing. Ruth pulled up a chair beside Elaine's bed. I'll stay with her. You all can go if you want. But I'm not leaving. Marcus sat down on the other side of the bed. Neither am I. So they waited, faith and fear in the same room, watching, hoping, praying that the hands of a janitor carried something the experts had forgotten. The first 30 minutes passed in suffocating silence. Ruth sat beside Elaine's bed, her hand resting lightly on the cloth covering the poultice. She wasn't checking for changes. Not yet. She was praying. Her lips moved without sound, her eyes closed, her breathing steady. Marcus watched her. Then he watched his wife. Then he watched the monitors tracking Elaine's vitals, heart rate, oxygen levels, blood pressure, as if they might reveal something the doctors had missed. The doctors themselves had mostly retreated to the far side of the room. Some stood with arms crossed. Others reviewed charts they'd already memorized. Dr. Brennan checked his phone twice, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that comes from watching your entire worldview get challenged by a woman holding a mop. Then, at minute 37, Elaine spoke. "It's cooling down." Everyone's head turned. Ruth opened her eyes. "That's good. That means it's working." "How do you know?" Marcus asked. "Because heat is inflammation. When it cools, the body's starting to listen." Elaine shifted slightly, and for the first time in days, she didn't wince. "The pressure, it feels different. Not lighter, just different." Ruth nodded. "That's the drawing. Your body's getting ready to release." At minute 52, one of the younger doctors, a resident named Dr. Patel, stepped closer to the bed. "May I check the area?" Ruth looked at Elaine, who nodded. Dr. Patel gently lifted the cloth. His eyes widened. The swelling, it's softer, significantly softer. Dr. Brennan moved quickly to the bedside, his skepticism warring with his medical training. He examined Elaine's face with gloved hands, his expression shifting from doubt to confusion. "This doesn't make sense. The tissue was rigid an hour ago." "It makes perfect sense," Ruth said quietly. "You just weren't trained to see it this way." At hour 2, the breakthrough came. Elaine gasped, not in pain, but in shock. "Something's happening." Ruth stood, her hand on Elaine's shoulder. "Breathe through it. Let your body do what it needs to do." The boil began to drain. Not violently, not explosively, but naturally, the way a river finds the sea, the way a wound finally opens to let out what's been trapped inside. Elaine wept. But this time, her tears weren't from suffering. They were from relief, deep, overwhelming, soul-shaking relief. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, it's working." Marcus stood frozen, his hand over his mouth, watching his wife's face begin to change. The angry red swelling that had dominated her features for days started to recede, slowly, gently, like a tide going out. Dr. Brennan stood silent, his medical certainty cracking like ice under spring sun. One of the nurses whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. Sometimes healing isn't violent. It's gentle. Sometimes the cure doesn't come with scalpels and stitches. Sometimes it comes with patience and prayer, and the kind of knowledge that lives in hands instead of textbooks." Ruth worked quickly now, replacing the poultice, cleaning the area with practiced efficiency, her movements calm and sure. "We'll need to do this twice more today, then once tomorrow. Then we monitor." Dr. Patel was taking notes. "What's in the mixture exactly?" Ruth told him. He wrote it all down. And Ruth noticed he didn't write with the condescension of someone humoring a fool. He wrote with the humility of someone learning. 3 days later, Elaine Carter sat up in bed without assistance. The swelling was almost gone. The infection had cleared. The pain, the unbearable, screaming pain that had stolen her sleep and her hope, was a memory. Dr. Brennan stood at the foot of her bed with her chart, his expression unreadable. "Medically speaking, this recovery is unprecedented." Ruth, who'd been preparing to leave for her morning shift, paused at the door. "Medically speaking, Dr. Brennan, some things don't fit in your charts. That doesn't make them less real." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something Ruth never expected. He nodded. "You were right, and I was wrong. Thank you for not listening to me." Ruth's eyes softened. "You weren't wrong, doctor. You just didn't know everything. None of us do. That's why we need each other." On the morning of Elaine's discharge, Marcus Carter found Ruth in the hallway outside the suite. She was back in her uniform, her mop bucket beside her, already starting her rounds. "Ruth, wait." She turned. Marcus approached slowly, like he wasn't sure how to carry what he was feeling. I need to thank you properly. I need to. He stopped, his voice breaking. You saved her life. Ruth shook her head gently. No, sir. God saved her life. I just showed up when he called. Marcus pulled an envelope from his pocket. This is for you. It's not payment. I know I can't pay you for what you did. It's gratitude. It's everything I don't know how to say. Ruth didn't take it. Sir, I don't need your money. Please. For your family. I don't have family, Ruth said quietly. Just my church. And they take care of me just fine. Then for yourself. For Mr. Carter. Ruth's voice was firm now, kind but unyielding. What I did wasn't for money. It was because God gave me something to give, and your wife needed it. If I take money for that, I make it transactional. And it wasn't. It was obedience. Marcus stared at her. This woman who'd saved his wife and refused his wealth, who'd risked everything and wanted nothing, who'd walked into his world of power and privilege and reminded him that some things can't be bought. Then what can I do? How can I thank you? Ruth smiled. You can remember that healing doesn't always come from the people you expect. You can remember that wisdom lives in places you weren't taught to look. And when someone tells you they can help, even if they don't have the credentials you think they need, maybe you listen a little faster next time. She handed him a folded piece of paper. Here's the instructions for the poultice. If the infection tries to come back, and it shouldn't, this is what you do. Any questions? You can find me. I'll be here. Mopping. She picked up her bucket and started down the hall. Ruth, Marcus called after her. She turned. Why did you risk everything for someone you didn't even know? Ruth's answer was simple, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from living a life rooted in something bigger than yourself. Because my grandmother taught me that when God puts knowledge in your hands, staying silent is the same as letting someone suffer. And I'd rather risk my freedom than live with that kind of silence. She nodded once, then disappeared around the corner, back to the work that had always been hers, back to the invisibility she'd never really minded, back to the life of a woman who'd just performed a miracle and wanted nothing but to keep serving. The miracle didn't come from power. It came from obedience. It came from a woman the world overlooked. It came from knowledge the system dismissed. It came from faith that didn't need validation, from hands that didn't need credentials, from a heart that chose action over safety. And it reminded everyone who witnessed it of a truth the world keeps forgetting. God uses the overlooked. Faith activates purpose. Wisdom isn't always certified. And healing, real healing, flows through humility, not through pride. Ruth Holloway went back to mopping floors, but she'd changed a billionaire's understanding of power. She'd changed 15 doctors' understanding of knowledge. And she'd changed one woman's understanding of who deserves to be heard. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.